This is the demo scene with the multi-language logic implementation. In this video, we'll show you how to implement this system. Here, we have a simple scene with a text. The first thing to do is adding the language text component to the text game object. You'll find the language template, ID name, and text component fields. For now, set the text field by dragging in at the text component. The ID name field will contain the ID of the language text to read. You can set this by writing manually or by selecting it from the language template. To create a language template, right-click on the project window, and navigate to the root, Create, Blartenix, Language Template. In this languages templates, you will define all the ID names for the language texts of your game. For now, let's define one. Then, just drag it to the language text field of the component and you'll see the ID name field updates to a selectable list automatically. When we define all our language text, we must add to the Sistema game object with the language manager component. This component will have all the language files for your game. To create a language file, go to the template object and hit the export button. This will generate an XML file that contains the tags for all the ID names you defined. Now you can edit this file for setting its values, the language name, and the tags values. When all values are set up, drag the file to the language manager list. If we test this, you will see it working. Now let's add another language, Spanish for example, so export the template and configure the XML file with the values for Spanish language. Drag it to the language files list. Now when you change the selected language in the language manager, you will see the corresponding value being loaded for the text. Now, let's create a script to change the language in runtime. We will change it when pressing the C key from the keyboard. Add the using Blartenix namespace statement at the top. Now we can reference the Language Manager component instance. First we have to get the current language. For setting the new one we will check if the current language is English. It means index 0 from the Language Manager list, so the next language will be Spanish, index 1, and if current is index 1, we'll set 0 for English. It's important to know that you cannot reference the Language Manager in awake method because its instance couldn't be ready. Then add this component to a game object in the scene and test. When pressing the C key, the language will change. Now let's add other text to the scene. We will need a new ID name for this one. We can do that in two ways. The first is to modify directly the XML language file. Copying the tag, and set the values. If you do this new ID name won't be defined in the template text list, so you will have to remove the template from the language text component and write manually the ID name. But we don't recommend this. It is better to create the text reference in the template, so create it, and for any modification, export again the template to avoid any error. Just like we're doing here for the Spanish language. Set the XML file values. Update the reference of the Spanish language file in the Language Manager component because we deleted the previous one. Finally, set the ID name for the new text. This is what you have to do if you modify the XML file and don't update the template object. Now test this and see it working.